Greetings all, this is Hairy Nick. How are you guys? It's been far too long since we sat down to have a chat about the game of X-Wing. Now, a bit over a month ago, we had revealed Wave 14 with the fix for the X-Wing and the U-Wing, which kind of leads us to ask, well, what ship are we looking to get a fix next? Because I think, by and large, for myself and most people I talk to, the X-Wing was that ship that we wanted fixed the most, in that it was both a very nostalgic ship, and it's a ship that performs pretty badly in terms of competitive play. I've always thought of the X-Wing as not a terrible ship, but just a very supremely middle-of-the-road ship. Just doesn't have any good spiky gameplay. I see a lot of people playing around with Wedge. Obviously, Biggs was quite successful back before he got his nerf. But overall, I think we can all agree that the ship badly needs the fix that it's going to receive soon. And the U-Wing is pretty much in the same boat. It was revealed to us in the movie Rogue One, and just a really cool concept for a ship. I've never spoken to anyone that doesn't like the idea of this ship, and I even like the design concept behind how it was implemented into the game of X-Wing. But ultimately, it just didn't quite hit the mark. A bit underpowered, and very good to see it getting a fix. So before we go on, just a few caveats. I do want to mention that we are going to go forward assuming that whatever happens to the X-Wing and U-Wing will fix it. So we're not going to talk about those today. And the list of ships here I'm going to talk about is based entirely on you guys' response. I posted this question a little while back, about a month ago on my social media. So if you want to be involved in any of these conversations, please follow me on Facebook and Twitter, because I do pose these questions in order to make content for the videos. So let's dive right into this in no particular order. Let's talk about this ship by ship and make the case as to why this might be difficult to implement, why this is needed, and just discuss each of these things. And if after this you guys think I've missed anything, please tell me in the comments and we can continue on that conversation. Let's start off with the Lambda class shuttle. And this is a very interesting case because the Lambda class shuttle is seeing real meta play, particularly in this list here with Quick Draw and the Inquisitor with the Power Bases list. But what we're seeing here is essentially the application of the Lambda class shuttle. He carries Palp and he takes a free system upgrade pretty much every time. The ship only really sees two different pilots in the Omicron group pilot and Captain Yor, and that's basically a bit of a point sink. Captain Yor can help you out with stress, but it's not really that flavorful or creative. I think the main reason you guys have been asking about this is not because it's not seeing meta play, but more it just doesn't offer much in terms of list building capability. It's pretty static in terms of what it does. And I think for me, looking at this ship, one of the biggest issues with it is it simply has upgrade slots that don't get used. I mean, obviously we use those two crew slots for Palp. In fact, any use of this ship over the course of its lifespan with like the Doom Shuttle with Darth Vader, for example, always used the crew slots, but the system and cannon slot barely ever saw use. And nowadays, the system slot just takes free upgrades, usually the collision detector. And I suspect moving forward, we might even see the targeting scrambler being used on this ship. But what basically never sees use is that cannon slot. And that's because this ship is very difficult to use with a cannon. You basically don't want to invest points on a ship that can't reliably get shots with a cannon, especially something like an HLC, which costs 7 points, which is just really unideal. And I don't really think a cannon is what this ship wants to be doing. It's a support ship, you carry crew, you support your other ships, and you don't rely on the attack from this ship. And that's why this slot feels a bit wasted. And you've got to appreciate the fact that when a ship is designed and costed, the upgrade slots it has affects how much the ship costs. So theoretically, it could not have the cannon slot and potentially cost 1 less point, and that is significant. That shows that there is wasted potential on this ship. And I just think what this ship could use is some form of way of better utilizing its upgrades, or just canning its upgrades altogether and giving it better upgrades. I've often thought I quite like the look of the cargo shuttles that were shown off in Rebels. The one that Hondo and Naka stole and turned into his personal transport ship. I still love that image of that Imperial shuttle with the giant pirate flag on the side. I'm so hoping that comes into the game of X-Wing at some stage. And my thoughts are, if we got something like that, we could also get something for the Lambda shuttle, which maybe gives it a cargo variant. People have pointed out to me in the past that yes, it technically is a different class of shuttle, so that might not work. But in terms of gameplay, it makes a lot of sense to me. Maybe if we give it a title that gets rid of the system, the cannon slot, maybe even one of those crew slots, and gives it something else, maybe even cargo. in the standard 100-point format might be an interesting design space to move into. I don't know. But I think the main thing is we can tweak these upgrade slots and get a lot more use out of the ship. But the biggest barrier for it is what I said before, in that is already seeing meta play, and tweaking it is going to be difficult. Because if you tweak a ship that's already seeing meta play, it might become way too overpowered. So you just got to be careful with that. And that's why I am erring on the side of, if it does change upgrade slots, it should lose a crew slot so it can no longer take palp. It basically gives you other options rather than just having palp and other better options for the ship, which just make it way too powerful. Anyway, let's move on to our next ship. Let's talk about the Y-Wing. And the Y-Wing is a bit of an interesting case. Because we have a few ships on this list that what I would describe as receiving a half fix, because the Y-Wing came out in Wave 1 only in its expansion pack. It was not in the core set, so it only had one release on the Rebel faction, and then it was released again on the Scum faction in the Most Wanted pack. And what that pack gave it was a fix in the bomb loadout card and the BTLA-4 Y-Wing card, but it did not get any more Rebel pilots, and I think that's very significant, and probably the reason it's on this list still. We got a bunch of Scum pilots, but even those are struggling to see play at the moment, and I think the biggest issue with the Y-Wing is simply on the Rebel faction, it doesn't have any pilots with an EPT slot. Now, that doesn't mean that the ship's completely unplayable. It does see use with the Stressbot build, and that's pretty cool. BTLA-4 Y-Wing, TLT, and R3A2. It's a cool little concept, but really, what iconically the Y-Wing did was it flew in both the Death Star battles. It had named pilots that were very highly trained and highly skilled. And just being this drone sort of build doesn't really feel like it's fulfilling the flavour of what the Y-Wing really wants to be doing. And I think ultimately it should have Rebel cards with EPT slots. Now the reason this happened, well, what I theorise anyway, is that Wave 1, 2, 3, around about that time, FFG didn't really appreciate the importance of the EPT slot, and they gave some ships no EPT slots, even with their higher pilot skills, because they, I don't know, maybe they were worried that it wasn't supposed to be on every ship, or it would make some ships too overpowered. But what we're seeing more and more nowadays is that's probably something they just need, as annoying as it is. We still don't have APTs on the K-Wing and the Ghost, but I think those are fringe exceptions to this rule. I think there are plenty of these older ships that don't have APT slots on their named pilots that badly need them, and the Y-Wing is absolutely top of that list. Let's move on now to the E-Wing, and the E-Wing was in the meta for a very long time. It's a very fun ship, but it's also very expensive. And I think what's the most telling of this is the most expensive pilot in the E-Wing, Corran Horn, which has seen the most meta play, now cost the same as Kylo Ren on the TIE Silencer. And you compare these side by side, there's no question. You want Kylo Ren over Corran Horn. And it's indicative of power creep. It's indicative of these new ships coming along and basically taking the limelight away from the older ships. And I think it just goes to show that things like dial and costing and all that kind of stuff has just moved a bit beyond what Corran Horn wants to be doing originally. But even so, the ship only really saw significant play with Corran Horn, and I really like what this ship's trying to do. It's just really fun, flavorful, just a really high-powered ship. Just squashed all the good stuff in all the different Rebel ships and stuck it all into one ship. Made it expensive, but that's okay. And I think if the design and building of the ship was just a bit more focused, we could see play even with the low pilot skill guys, and that'd be really fun to see. It has some useful upgrades in the systems upgrade, Torpedo Astromech, which are good, but they're certainly not as significant as they were when they first came out. Particularly the Astromech system, that was unique back when the E-Wing came out, and that's somewhat being overshadowed, especially now with the Sheathipede class shuttle. It doesn't have the system slot, but it does have the crew slot. And the Astromech slot, and it can do a lot more thing with that combination. And maybe in order to push this ship over the edge, it could use some unique upgrades that fill those slots. Maybe a new title that just gave it a bit more of a kick, a bit more flavour. If it really is going to sit at the top of the pedestal in Rebel ships, being the most expensive one that tries to do everything, it really needs a bit more push, maybe with more upgrades, action on the action bar. And maybe a title is what this ship needs to move forward. Let's move on to the TIE Punisher, which really, when we look at it, is pretty much the worst of the small base bombers. This ship really struggles when we compare it to things like the K-Wing or the Skirg bomber or all the stuff the different factions have, and it's really the most versatile bomber the Imperials have. Ironically, the top bomber only has one bomb slot, so it can't take the bomber generator and all that kind of stuff. Probably the best thing going for the TIE Punisher is it has that system slot, which is very useful. It can take Minefield Mapper or the Trajectory Simulator, and that's pretty cool. But really, if we're going to set this as the benchmark for Imperial bombing, it does need a bit more of a push, because it is pretty much the worst of all these small bomber options. In my mind, just having a look at all the different upgrades this ship can take, I think what it's most significantly missing is a crew, and a relevant crew to go with it. On the Scum faction, the Rebel faction, we have Cad Bane, we have Sabine. Even Cad Bane's not that useful. At least it gives us a bit more options when it comes to bombing. And I don't know if putting this style of card on the Imperial faction is necessarily the right way to go. I always prefer when FFG move into different design concepts rather than just do the same thing over and over again. Having said that though, this does need a bit of a push in some direction. And I think at least the crew slot might be a great way to go here. I think probably what its biggest barrier is simply the meta at large, and FFG did a really good job of just curtailing the bombing meta enough so it wasn't so oppressive over the last couple of waves, particularly with Guns for Hire and the release of Wave 12-13. And I think if FFG are seriously considering issues with the meta and that kind of stuff, they don't want to exactly rush to fix the worst bomber in the game and make it as competitive as the rest. That really pushes the bombing meta forward. I've talked before about the problems of a bombing meta and the way it affects the natural flow of the game. I think by and large people like the dogfighting aspect of X-Wing, and I do as well. And bombing is fine, but when it becomes too oppressive, it makes all the dogfighting aspects of the game take a back seat. And that leads to negative gameplay. I'm not saying bombing is bad in and itself, but it's something that always has to be approached very carefully, and I think that's the biggest issue with fixing the TIE Punisher. Alright, let's move on to the next ship, which is another Imperial ship, the TIE Interceptor, and this is a very, very interesting case, because it already had an initial release and a fix. So right out of the gate, this is very difficult. Basically, to fix this ship again in another pack, it would set a precedent FFG have never done before. And it may also be dangerous from the point of view of complexity, because if we just give ships fixes over and over again, it means we have to buy a lot of different packs, we have to source cards from different packs, and that's really unideal. I think if FFG are ever going to fix the TIE Interceptor, it might have to be in a separate pack. Maybe it comes with an epic ship, or there's a larger pack of Imperial things that has some TIE Interceptor cards, but you get value from other things in that. Yeah, it's just something that I think we have to be cautious when talking about. And another huge barrier with the TIE Interceptor is it's not strictly a bad ship. The reason it's struggling right now is because of the meta, because we've basically had a stabilised bombing meta. In that bombing list consistently make tournaments, and this ship hates bombing. It excels in a dogfighting meta because basically it's one of the best dogfighters on the table. And it's so spiky because it only has that 3 hull, but it is so good at defending itself during combat. But that of course means that anything with auto damage like bombs or some turrets or other upgrades that do that basically just completely wreck this ship, and it's just such a spiky platform. And it lacks versatility to kind of adapt to this ever-flowing meta. Look, from a flavour point of view, this makes a lot of sense. The ship is purely a dogfighter with very, very high manoeuvrability. It is a home run in terms of getting this ship right in the game. But moving forward, I mean, how do we curtail that? It's very difficult. It's very difficult to find a way to get this into the current meta without completely changing the meta, and that's what I worry. This has a lot of barriers to getting fixed. And I wanted to mention it because you guys brought it up, and you guys obviously want to see it on the table, and I agree. It's an iconic ship. When I see this, I imagine the Battle of the Second Death Star. It was so iconic in that battle. Looks so cool. I remember as a kid seeing this for the first time, just thinking how utterly cool these things looked. Obviously inspired the look of the TIE Silencer, which is another awesome new ship, which I quite like. And it's one of these things, it has a lot of barriers in terms of gameplay, but it's a fun, flavourful ship that we just want to see on the table again. Alright, let's move back over to my beloved Scum faction with the YV666. And this is interesting because it's not completely devoid of meta play. I do see Bosk occasionally on the table, accompanying Asajj Ventress. He's definitely not the worst pilot to take. Essentially what this ship is what I would describe as the biggest, doofiest cannon in the game of X-Wing. It's slow, it's floaty, it has a 180-degree cannon, and it's really fun. I really love the design concept of this ship. Having the 3 crew on the Scum faction is very exciting. It's very, very fun in terms of list building. I still think this is a relevant ship because of all the different combinations it can take. And in terms of getting a fix, it's very easy to fix by proxy, because any new crew on the Scum faction potentially pushes the power level of this ship massively, because even one more crew combos with all the existing crew in the game, and that basically means that you suddenly have all these different options just from one new card existing. The biggest drawbacks of this ship is it doesn't have an EPT on the named pilots apart from Bosk. Moralo, Ival, and Latarazi do not have EPTs, and that basically makes them unplayable, unfortunately. I think Moralo Ival in particular legitimately would be playable if he had an EPT. Firing an HLC 180 degrees is no joke, it's very powerful. I've seen people combo this with IG-88D and IG-88B in the aggressor, just to get that double tapping ability, but it's just not quite there. People still gravitate to Bosk or the Trandoshan Slaver to take that discounted platform with 3 crews on it. We're not seeing the Trandoshan Slaver as much because obviously the bounty bus was nerfed when it was ruled that Zuckuss cannot be used when you already have stress on your ship. But even again, the Trandoshan Slaver still has potential with other crew options, and that's really cool. The other biggest issue with this ship is I think it really has some of the worst unique cards that attach to it in its modification and its title. I think a lot of us actually forget that this ship has a unique modification in maneuver fins. This is just not a very strong card. Whenever I've seen modifications on this, it's pretty much always guidance chips if you have a missile, or engine upgrades. Engine upgrades is a very powerful card in this ship because it helps it turn round, which is very, very significant with that arc. And I've never been a fan of the title, the Houndstooth, that helps you launch the Nushta Pup when the ship explodes, for the simple reason that it costs 6 points and it's only relevant when you are actively losing the game. And I personally don't build my list like that. I guess from the point of view, if it's really close and scrappy and you are just neck and neck with your opponent, they have one ship, they just blow up the Houndstooth, you get the Nushta Pup out, and for some reason a Z95 is the difference between you killing their ship and not, sure, but that's a very fringe scenario. Otherwise, it basically just has no value, doesn't give you any MOV. The Nushta Pup is worth 0, in case you weren't aware. And I don't like this title. I think it could have been done much better. And more to the point, I don't like that this is how the Nushta Pup was even introduced in the game in the first place. And we'll talk about that more towards the end of this video. But for the time being, let's move on to the next ship. Actually, ships this time, because we're going to talk about 2. The G1A Starfighter, more commonly referred to as the Mist Hunter, and the B-Wing, because these two guys are very, very similar. The differences is the Mist Hunter has a native crew slot and a slightly better dial in that it has 1 more K-turn, and the B-Wing has a better hull to shield ratio, also a torpedo and a cannon slot. But apart from that, the dials are very similar, both 1 agility, 3 primary, and very similar in terms of durability. And these guys are often compared to each other when we look at how they're implemented. And basically, both of these ships are struggling, despite the fact that the Mist Hunter is basically a newer, better version of the B-Wing. It has the better dial, and it has the crew slot natively. And the B-Wing was previously given the crew slot in the B-Wing E2 modification card that came in the Rebel Aces pack, which in terms of a fix was, again, I think this is a case of FFG being early on in the design phase, and this was what they considered a fix, despite the fact that it costed more and didn't really improve the platform per se. A crew is relevant on a B-Wing, I'm not going to take away from that by any stretch of the imagination, but newer fixes tend not to increase the cost of a ship. Plenty actually reduce the cost of the ship. Stubbup Mark II, Vaxi, both the TIE Defender tiles. I'd be very surprised if the X-Wing fix cost any points, for example. And I think FFG felt like we're trying to make everything as balanced as possible, so we don't want to push ships too far. We're basically, I guess, not dealing with power creep at this stage of the game. Maybe when this came out around, wave 4 or 5 or whenever it was, they considered the fact that we want to try and keep everything as balanced as possible, so pushing a ship with a 0-point upgrade really wasn't where they wanted to be. And from a design point of view, I can understand why that is, but in terms of where the game is now, that's not where the ship wants to be. It wants relevant stuff. It basically wants free upgrades. that makes it relevant. Ships nowadays are efficient, all their upgrades are relevant, and that's basically where we want everything in the game to be currently. And the good thing about both of these is they both have an open slot that hasn't been used yet. The B-Wing has no title, and the Mist Hunter has no modification, so there definitely is scope to fix these guys. I think in terms of what they want to be doing, the B-Wing, in my mind, is always that really heavy platform, which is why it has the cannon slot. When the Alpha Class Starwing was released and they put in the linked battery, I looked at this card and thought, okay, this is designed primarily for the B-Wing, but it's still a 2-point card that's not that effectual on the B-Wing and not strictly better than just taking fire control systems. I think in most scenarios, fire control systems is just the better card. But I like what this is doing. The B-Wing, as I've said before, this is one of my biggest issues when it comes to design with cannons. We don't want cannons on platform that already has 3 primary attack dice. And I think one of the best things the B-Wing could be doing is taking some kind of unique cannon that improves its attack. It doesn't cost much, doesn't replace its primary attack. I think being the heavy knife fighter, that's probably where the ship wants to be. As for the Mist Hunter, I really like this ship. It's a very fun, flavorful ship to build with. I think it was made largely irrelevant when the Protectorate Starfighter came out in the next wave right after it. But the Mist Hunter still needs, I don't know, just a bit of a push. Maybe some kind of modification that improves its efficiency. It can do a lot of cool different things. It obviously came with the cloaking device, tractor beam, has that barrel roll when you take the Mist Hunter title, has a system slot, so it's a very cool, versatile ship. But maybe the ship needs a bit more focus, so maybe that's something we can think about with a modification upgrade. Okay, and moving right along, we have the TIE Fighter. Now, one of you guys suggested this, and I agree. I think the biggest issue with the TIE Fighter is it has cool meta lists that are struggling right now, largely because of the auto damage, the bombing meta. Anything in the meta that has control, tractor, that kind of stuff, the TIE Fighter really suffers against. And I think the biggest barrier from giving the humble TIE Fighter a fix is simply the fact that it is flown en masse, and any fix you give it appears suddenly on many, many different ships, and that can quickly push the power level up through the roof. So you've got to be very careful. A nice restrained fix, I think, is what the TIE Fighter could use, if indeed it gets a fix at all. Now, most recently, the TIE Fighter has seen play in this build here, the Crack Swarm, that uses Black Squadron TIE Fighters and Crack Shot, as well as other TIE Fighters with Crack Shot, and there's a bit of mix and matching going on here, but this is essentially the bones of this build. And it's just good basic stats across the board. Crack Shot is a very powerful card, especially when you can have it on multiple platforms. That's really devastating. You can do a really powerful Alpha Strike, even without missiles and torpedoes. This build, although it does not look like it, has a lot of really effective firepower. And I think what's cool about this is it's another build where we have a lot of squadron formation, a very powerful thing to do on the Galactic Empire, and also very powerful in the Rebel faction. And I think, in my mind, that's the biggest thing that would help these ships along, which is kind of missing from the game of X-Wing. I want to table this idea, and I want to hear your guys' thoughts on this. I'd love to see some kind of squadron mechanic, where you have a leader amongst your squadron, and you have ships that follow it. And if you stay in formation, if you stay near the leader, you get some kind of bonus. We've seen this kind of idea implemented before. Obviously, Biggs helps out his friendly guys. Lorik helps out the friendly guys around him. Howlrunner on the Imperial faction does this as well. But I would love to see this done, maybe a different type of upgrade, or maybe they do this as titles. I don't know. But I just love the idea that you can fly ship as a squadron and you can receive orders from your leader, and that gives your ships some kind of bonus. And particularly when I look at TIE Fighters, I think this would be utterly fantastic. And I think more to the point, in terms of design space, this would be fantastic because it would heavily differentiate the Rebel and Imperial faction from the Scum faction. The Scum faction, in my mind, is already very similar to the Rebel faction in terms of the frames, the type of ships it flies. And if there was some kind of squadron mechanic that was used on the Rebel faction, it would mean that ships that are flown on both factions would be very different in terms of their design. And just bringing this back to the TIE Fighter, I think this would be a fantastic way of improving the ship. And it would be fantastic for swarms in general. It'd be a really cool way of getting some kind of bonus, giving you, the player, a benefit from putting more copies of the same kind of ship on the table. And giving you some kind of bonus from not just flying two big ships, which is what the game is heavily gravitating towards at the moment. And that also carries on to this next ship. I want to talk about the TIE FO, very similar to the TIE Fighter. This is seeing meta play with a Mega Leader. We saw Epsilon Ace in the list that took the systems open in Birmingham, UK. So it's definitely not a terrible platform at the moment. But I think if there was a blanket upgrade that improved the TIE Fighter, it could also be effective on the TIE FO, so long as it didn't give a Mega Leader a big push. I already think this ship is insane for 26 points, so we've got to be very careful with that kind of thing. And again, squadron flying could be really cool. And I was mentioning factions before. We're talking about Imperial and First Order. Obviously, these are different armies. And if we wanted squadron style flying, we probably would want to keep them within the same sub-faction, or maybe even on the same platform. I don't know. Again, in the comments, guys, tell me what you think of this, because I think this is a great way to give some of these older ships a bit more relevancy. And before we wrap up this list, I want to throw in my 2 cents, because this is a ship that none of you guys mentioned, but I would like to see this ship improve, the Z95 Headhunter. I like this ship a lot. It kind of got one of these sort of quote-unquote half fixes, in that it was in the most wanted pack. It got scum pilots, but it got no real fix cards, no titles, no modifications. And again, I think this would be a great ship on the Rebel faction to get some kind of squadron mechanic. It would be great in that sense, because then we'd have it on both the Rebel faction and the Scum faction. And it would be heavily different on those 2 factions, because one faction would have squadrons and one faction would have all the flavorful, unique pilots. Obviously, Nadrusalak is a pilot that I love flying with. And more to the point, there are unique Z95s in the extended universe, but this criminally has no title cards on this ship. There's the Nashtar Pup, and I previously mentioned this. I don't like the way it was implemented in the game. I would love to see a Bosk pilot card for the Z95 and a Nashtar Pup title, and it could just have the caveat on it: you cannot take the Houndstooth if you take this title on a Z95. Obviously, that would put 2 Nashtar Pups on the field at the same time, and you can't do that. And Nadrusalaks, I mean, let's look at this Z95. Look at this ship. Tell me this wasn't modified. Tell me this hot rod paint job gold engine ship was never modified. This is criminal that this has no title. And more to the point, the way this ship's used heavily on the Scum faction is usually just with Binyari pirates or that kind of thing, just as a good cheap 12-point pilot. I like this at 12 points. I don't think there's anything wrong with the pirates per se, but it's not what Scum's about. Scum's about uniqueness, flavorful pilots. And I think if there was just some way to implement that in the game, some kind of like squadron card that made these fly in formation on the Rebel faction, it would be really cool. It would push the 2 different factions, even with the same ship, in different design concepts, and it would be just really, really, really fun. And I think in closing, that's what I really want to see if any of these ships I spoke about today get a fix. We want to see something that benefits the game, not just brings up the power level so everything is as competitive as everything else. I mean, obviously the game of X-Wing is designed in such a way that, yes, we want to try and achieve that, but we want to move into different design space as well. Giving ships fixes are a good excuse for FFG to explore new, different ideas. And I love the idea of flying things in squadrons. If there was a way to represent that in the game, apart from just flying it in formation, if there were actual cards and there were actual benefits from doing that, I think that'd be really cool. All in all, if any of these ships are going to receive a fix, I want to see not just improvements on the ships to make them as competitive as all the other ships, but actual ways to make them flavorful. Introduce something new and exciting into the game. I don't think that's a thing that can only happen with new ships. I think that can happen with old ships. Old ships can breathe life into the game, and I think we can all agree the game has enough ships as it is. If FFG did an entire wave of just fixing old ships, I certainly wouldn't complain. And I certainly wouldn't complain if ships, even things like the Y-Wings, the Z95s, ships that have kind of got fixes before, got a fix again, even just different pilot cards in different packs, even just anything like that, I wouldn't complain, especially when it comes to iconic ships. I don't think we can print enough X-Wings and TIE Fighters. That's my opinion anyway, and thank you so much for all that input, guys. I really appreciate all the help with this, and I just want to thank you guys, because without your interaction on social media, these discussion-style videos are just not possible for me to make, and I think this is definitely a very interesting thing. It's a very passionate subject for a lot of people, what ships they want to see fixed, because we obviously have a whatever kind of attachment to these ships, whether that be nostalgia or we just like the way it plays plays in the game. And I think those things, as well as just basic competitive play, are important factors. Because at the end of the day, we play this game because we love it. And you can't tell me why I love to fly the ships I do. I just do, and that's the way I choose to engage with the game. Anyway, guys, I've rambled on for far too long. Like and subscribe, like me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter, and I will catch you guys later.